Thank you for participating in the Jeanne Manor Elevator Modernization RFP. This report provides an anonymous comparative review of the procurement process, highlighting market observations, proposal differentiators, and benchmarking insights to help participating vendors understand the evaluation and strengthen future proposals. Every proposal submitted required a significant investment of time, engineering, estimating, and technical expertise. We sincerely appreciate your participation. Rather than simply notifying vendors of the procurement outcome, Proposabid believes the procurement process should also provide value back to the vendor community. This report summarizes how the market responded to the RFP, where proposals aligned and differed, how submissions compared against the RFP requirements, and the factors that influenced the comparative evaluation. To preserve confidentiality, every contractor has been assigned a vendor number. The same report has been provided to every participating vendor. Our goal is not to identify winners and losers. Our goal is to increase transparency, improve future proposal quality, and help elevate procurement standards across the industry. Before we begin the comparative review, I'd like to briefly walk through today's presentation. We'll start with an overview of the procurement and how the market responded to the RFP. From there, we'll examine anonymous comparisons across pricing, scope, technical approaches, qualifications, commercial terms, and risk allocation. We'll also highlight the factors that differentiated proposals, discuss observations from the procurement process, and share lessons learned that can help strengthen future submissions. Finally, we'll conclude with the procurement outcome and how Proposabid intends to continue building a more transparent and collaborative procurement process for both owners and vendors. Before reviewing the comparative analysis, it's important to establish the context of this procurement. This report is not intended to critique any individual vendor. Instead, it documents how the procurement process unfolded, how the market responded to the RFP, how proposals were evaluated, and what observations emerged from the comparative review. Every participating vendor has received this same report. Vendor identities remain confidential, allowing the focus to remain on proposal characteristics, market trends, and procurement outcomes rather than individual companies. Before comparing proposals, it's important to understand how this procurement was evaluated. 5 qualified vendors participated in the RFP. Every proposal underwent a structured comparative review designed to evaluate submissions on consistent criteria rather than individual preferences. Throughout the evaluation process, the focus remained on the proposal itself, its technical scope, commercial terms, completeness, schedule, risk allocation, and owner responsibilities. Factors such as incumbent relationships, company size, marketing materials, or price alone did not determine the outcome. Instead, the objective was to create an equitable, apples-to-apples comparison that allowed ownership to make an informed procurement decision. The following sections summarize how those proposals compared across the major evaluation categories. Before reviewing the comparative analysis, we'd like to summarize the procurement itself. This project followed a structured, competitive RFP process designed to encourage broad market participation while providing ownership with comparable proposals. 5 qualified vendors were invited to participate, and all 5 submitted proposals, resulting in a 100% response rate. Following proposal receipt, Proposabid completed a detailed comparative evaluation, normalizing proposals where necessary to support a fair, consistent, and objective review. The procurement has now concluded, and the information presented in this report reflects the final comparative evaluation of all participating proposals. Before comparing the individual proposals, it's important to understand the project characteristics that shaped this procurement. Every capital project has unique operational, technical, and commercial considerations that influence how proposals are evaluated. In this case, Jeanne Manor is an occupied senior housing community, which meant resident safety, operational continuity, and minimizing disruption were critical throughout the modernization process. The project also required maintaining elevator service whenever feasible, making construction sequencing, scheduling, and phasing important evaluation factors. Beyond simply replacing equipment, owners needed confidence that the modernization could be completed while supporting the day-to-day operation of the building. Another important aspect of this procurement was that the RFP did not prescribe a single technical solution. Vendors were encouraged to evaluate the existing conditions independently and recommend the approach they believed would best meet the property's long-term needs. This allowed the evaluation to compare not only pricing, but also engineering judgment, modernization philosophy, and execution strategy. As a result, the comparative evaluation extended well beyond technical scope. We reviewed how clearly each proposal communicated its commercial terms, execution approach, owner responsibilities, assumptions, and overall project risk. The following sections demonstrate how these project characteristics influenced proposal development and ultimately contributed to the comparative evaluation. With the project context established, we can now begin examining how each proposal responded to these requirements and where meaningful differences emerged across the competitive field. One of the objectives of this RFP was to allow the market, not the owner, to recommend the most appropriate intervention strategy. Rather than prescribing a single solution, vendors were invited to evaluate the existing conditions and determine whether repair, modernization, or full replacement represented the best long-term approach. Interestingly, every participating vendor independently recommended modernization. No vendor proposed a repair-only solution, and no vendor recommended complete replacement. This level of consensus across 5 independent firms provided ownership with confidence that the modernization approach represented the most appropriate balance of cost, lifecycle value, and operational improvement. One of the more significant outcomes of this procurement occurred before proposal comparisons even began. The RFP intentionally allowed each contractor to determine the most appropriate intervention strategy based on its own engineering assessment. Vendors were not directed toward modernization. They were free to recommend repair, modernization, or complete replacement. Despite working independently, every participating contractor recommended modernization. That level of technical agreement provided confidence that the evaluation should focus on the quality of the modernization proposals themselves, their scope, commercial structure, execution approach, assumptions, and long-term value, rather than debating which intervention strategy was appropriate. One of the more notable outcomes of this procurement was not what vendors proposed, it was what they chose not to propose. Although the RFP invited repair, modernization, and full replacement strategies, no participant recommended a repair-only approach or complete replacement. Instead, the market independently converged on modernization as the appropriate intervention. This eliminated the need to compare fundamentally different solution types and allowed the evaluation to focus on how each contractor approached modernization itself. With the procurement framework established, we now transition from the project itself to the market's response. The following section is not intended to explain the elevator industry. Rather, it documents how 5 independent contractors interpreted the same RFP, evaluated the same existing conditions, and developed 5 independent proposals. We'll examine where the market demonstrated strong consensus, where proposals began to differentiate themselves, and how those differences influenced the comparative evaluation. From this point forward, the discussion shifts from the project to the proposals themselves. Before reviewing the proposals themselves, it's important to recognize the environment in which those proposals were developed. Elevator modernization differs from many construction trades. The industry operates within a specialized ecosystem shaped by licensing requirements, union labor in many markets, extensive code oversight, a limited technician workforce, and a relatively small pool of qualified contractors. These characteristics influence proposal development, scheduling, pricing, and overall market participation. Understanding this environment provides important context for interpreting the comparative evaluation that follows. The objective is not to excuse proposal differences, but to recognize the operating conditions that affect every contractor competing in this market. During the evaluation process, ownership naturally considers previous service experiences and public reputation. However, those experiences should be viewed within the realities of the elevator service industry. Emergency calls occur when systems have already failed, parts availability is often outside the contractor's control, and highly specialized technicians may be serving multiple properties across a large region. For that reason, Proposabid treats service reputation as one input among many. It is considered alongside proposal quality, technical completeness, execution strategy, qualifications, and commercial terms to create a balanced comparative evaluation. Throughout the evaluation process, every proposal was assessed using the same comparative framework. Rather than focusing on a single attribute such as price, company size, or reputation, the evaluation considered each proposal as a complete solution. Technical scope, commercial structure, execution strategy, risk allocation, long-term value, and proposal quality were all reviewed together to understand how each submission addressed the project objectives. This structured approach helped ensure the proposals were compared consistently and transparently while recognizing that each contractor presented a different overall strategy. Up to this point, we focused on the procurement process and the characteristics of the elevator modernization market. We now transition to the comparative evaluation itself. The following section examines how each proposal responded to the same RFP requirements. While every contractor independently recommended modernization, the proposals differed in technical approach, commercial structure, project execution, owner responsibilities, assumptions, exclusions, pricing, and overall presentation. Throughout this section, vendor identities remain anonymous. The objective is not to rank companies by reputation, but to understand how each proposal compared when evaluated using the same methodology. The table shown here provides a high-level summary of all 5 submitted proposals. Every proposal has been anonymized and assigned a vendor number. Where necessary, proposals were normalized to establish a consistent basis for comparison. While all 5 contractors recommended modernization, the proposals varied in pricing, project duration, commercial structure, technical approach, and overall strategy. These differences became the focus of the comparative evaluation rather than the intervention type itself. The following sections examine those differences in greater detail. Up to this point, we've established that all 5 contractors independently recommended the same overall project direction, a modernization. That consensus simplified one aspect of the owner's decision, but it did not eliminate the need for a comparative evaluation. The real differences between proposals were found in how each contractor approached execution, allocated risk, defined scope, structured commercial terms, and communicated their solution. The following slides examine those differentiators individually to illustrate where proposals aligned and where they meaningfully separated from one another. One of the most important observations from this procurement is that the proposals were far more alike than they were different. Every contractor independently concluded that modernization was the appropriate long-term solution for Jeanne d'Arc Manor. Where the proposals began to separate was not in what they recommended, but how they proposed to deliver it. Some proposals included a broader technical scope, while others required additional owner participation or assumed work would be completed outside of the contract. Commercial structures varied, schedules differed, pricing transparency ranged from highly detailed to more limited, and long-term equipment strategies reflected different philosophies. These differences are exactly what Proposabid's comparative evaluation is designed to identify. Rather than focusing solely on the lowest price or the highest scope, the evaluation considered how each proposal balanced technical completeness, commercial clarity, execution strategy, and long-term value. The matrix on this slide summarizes the primary areas where proposals differentiated themselves before we examine each category in greater detail. One of the most important outcomes of this procurement was that the differences between proposals extended well beyond price. Every contractor independently recommended modernization, but each proposal reflected a different philosophy regarding scope, commercial structure, execution strategy, owner responsibilities, and long-term serviceability. These became the primary evaluation variables used throughout the comparative review. Rather than focusing on any single factor, Proposabid evaluated how each proposal balanced these variables as an integrated solution to the owner's objectives. The following slides examine each of these evaluation variables individually so that vendors can better understand where proposals aligned and where they differentiated. Up to this point, we've discussed the procurement process, the market response, and the major variables that differentiated the proposals. We now move into the detailed comparative review. Each of the following slides focuses on a single evaluation category. Rather than reviewing each vendor independently, every proposal is compared side by side using the same evaluation criteria. This approach makes it easier to understand where proposals were similar, where they differed, and how those differences influence the overall comparative evaluation. Throughout this section, vendor identities remain anonymous to maintain the focus on proposal characteristics rather than company names. One of the biggest misconceptions in elevator procurement is that adding more equipment wins projects. It doesn't. Every vendor included controllers, drives, ADA upgrades, door equipment, and fire service improvements. From the board's perspective, these became baseline expectations, not competitive advantages. The proposals began to separate only when vendors explained how retained equipment would continue performing over the long term. This slide shows where proposals actually started separating. Owners rarely debate controller replacement. They debate retained equipment, modernization philosophy, documentation quality, and future reliability. Whenever equipment is retained, the vendor should explain why, not simply assume the owner understands. One of the key findings from this procurement is that owners do not evaluate proposals by simply counting the amount of equipment being replaced. While equipment replacement was largely consistent across the competing proposals, the highest scoring submissions differentiated themselves by reducing uncertainty and increasing owner confidence. For example, when equipment was retained, proposals that explained the remaining service life, documented inspection findings, and justified the decision from a lifecycle perspective were viewed more favorably than those that simply listed retained components. Complete and organized scope documentation also played a significant role. Clearly separating optional work from the base scope, documenting exclusions, and explaining long-term maintenance strategies made proposals easier to evaluate and compare. Perhaps most importantly, the strongest proposals told a story. Rather than presenting only technical specifications, they explained the modernization philosophy, why key decisions were made, and how those decisions supported the owner's long-term operational objectives. The lesson from this procurement is straightforward. Confidence is built through documentation, transparency, and explanation. Vendors who clearly communicate not only what they are proposing, but why, consistently strengthen their competitive position. This slide summarizes the characteristics that consistently strengthen proposals during the comparative evaluation. While every procurement is different, several practices repeatedly increased owner confidence and improved proposal competitiveness. One of the most effective ways to build confidence was by explaining retained equipment. When vendors documented why components were being retained, their condition, and their expected remaining service life, owners had greater confidence in the long-term modernization strategy. Clear proposal organization also mattered. Separating optional work from the base scope, defining exclusions up front, and documenting coordination responsibilities reduced ambiguity and made proposals easier to evaluate. Transparency helped owners understand exactly what was included, what was excluded, and what responsibilities remained with each party. The strongest proposals also went beyond technical specifications. They explained the overall modernization philosophy, the rationale behind key decisions, and how the proposed approach supported long-term reliability, maintainability, and operational value. This helped non-technical decision-makers better understand the proposal. Finally, proposals that reduced owner assumptions and clearly documented project coordination demonstrated a higher level of project readiness. Owners consistently favored submissions that minimized uncertainty and simplified the decision-making process. The overall lesson from this procurement is straightforward. Strong modernization proposals don't necessarily include more equipment. They communicate more clearly, explain decisions more effectively, and make it easier for owners to move forward with confidence. First, many of the core modernization components, including controllers, drives, ADA upgrades, and door equipment, were included across nearly every proposal. These items have become baseline expectations in a modern elevator modernization project and, by themselves, no longer serve as meaningful competitive differentiators. Where proposals began to separate was in how vendors communicated their long-term strategy. Lifecycle planning, the rationale for retaining or replacing equipment, and the overall modernization philosophy consistently influenced owner confidence and proposal competitiveness. Documentation quality also proved to be a significant differentiator. Proposals that were well organized, clearly explained assumptions, and transparently documented inclusions, exclusions, and coordination requirements were easier to evaluate and inspired greater confidence. From a commercial perspective, proposals that clearly allocated owner responsibilities and minimized uncertainty reduced perceived project risk. Owners responded favorably to submissions that made responsibilities easy to understand before contract award. Ultimately, the highest-ranked proposals were not simply those with the lowest price or the broadest scope. They were the proposals that reduced uncertainty through clear communication, transparent documentation, thoughtful lifecycle planning, and a balanced allocation of project responsibilities. The broader takeaway from this procurement is that technical capability was expected. The proposals that stood out were those that made the owner's decision easier by providing greater clarity, confidence, and long-term value. Scheduling was another area where the proposals were more similar than different. Every contractor planned to maintain at least one operational elevator throughout construction and proposed a phased modernization approach. Those elements were viewed as baseline expectations for an occupied senior housing community. They did not create a competitive advantage on their own. Where proposals began to separate was in the level of planning and communication they provided. Project durations varied considerably, and vendors who clearly explained their sequencing, milestones, and resident coordination made it easier for ownership to understand how the work would be executed. Transparency also mattered. One proposal proactively identified a brief period when both elevators would be temporarily out of service. Rather than creating concern, that level of disclosure increased confidence because it demonstrated thoughtful planning and set expectations in advance. The strongest scheduling presentations didn't simply promise a faster project. They clearly explained how construction would progress, how residents would be protected, and how operational disruptions would be managed throughout the modernization. The takeaway for vendors is that owners evaluate schedule certainty as much as schedule length. A well-documented execution plan builds more confidence than an aggressive timeline with limited detail. One of the clearest findings from this procurement is that scheduling alone does not win projects. Confidence in the schedule does. Every proposal utilized phased construction, so that approach became the market baseline rather than a competitive advantage. What differentiated proposals was how well vendors explained their execution strategy and reduced uncertainty for ownership. Project durations varied by several months, but a longer schedule was not automatically viewed as a weakness. Vendors who clearly explained why additional time improved quality, reduced risk, or better managed resident impacts helped ownership understand the trade-offs involved. Resident communication also emerged as an important consideration. The strongest proposals described not only how construction would be performed, but how residents, property management, and daily operations would be coordinated throughout the project. Detailed sequencing, milestone schedules, inspections, and turnover planning consistently increased confidence because they demonstrated preparation and project readiness. The broader lesson for vendors is that owners value predictability more than optimism. A well-documented schedule that clearly explains the path to successful completion is often more competitive than an aggressive timeline with limited supporting detail. One of the most significant differentiators in this procurement was not what vendors included, it was what responsibility remained with ownership. Nearly every proposal required some level of owner coordination, but the amount and clarity of those responsibilities varied considerably. Areas such as fire alarm coordination, electrical infrastructure, emergency power, restoration work, permitting, and telecommunications were handled differently across the proposals. From the owner's perspective, unclear responsibility allocation creates uncertainty. When assumptions, exclusions, or coordination requirements are not clearly documented, owners must anticipate additional project management, potential change orders, and unforeseen costs after contract award. The strongest proposals were not necessarily those with the fewest exclusions. They were the ones that clearly identified who was responsible for each activity, documented assumptions up front, and explained the coordination process from permitting through final inspection. The key takeaway for vendors is simple: transparency reduces perceived risk. Clearly defining owner responsibilities, contractor responsibilities, and project assumptions makes proposals easier to evaluate, improves comparability, and increases owner confidence long before construction begins. This procurement reinforced that clearly defining scope is just as important as defining price. Across the 5 proposals, many structural assumptions, retained components, restoration responsibilities, and owner obligations were technically acceptable, but they were not always explained with the same level of clarity. When information was assumed rather than documented, owners were left with additional questions during the evaluation. The strongest proposals consistently reduced uncertainty by clearly identifying restoration limits, describing testing and commissioning procedures, explaining the condition and expected service life of retained equipment, and minimizing owner assumptions wherever possible. An important lesson is that owners generally accept exclusions and retained equipment when they are well documented. What creates concern is ambiguity. The less owners have to interpret or assume, the greater their confidence in the proposal. The takeaway for vendors is that proposal competitiveness is often improved not by adding more scope, but by making the proposed scope easier to understand. Clear documentation, defined responsibilities, and transparent explanations reduce perceived project risk and strengthen the overall evaluation. The proposals that scored highest weren't necessarily the ones with the fewest exclusions. They were the ones that made owner responsibilities easy to understand. Transparency consistently outperformed ambiguity. The following summarizes how each proposal presented the contractor's qualifications, experience, organizational strengths, and market positioning. This comparison reflects information documented within each proposal and supporting materials. Every contractor participating in this procurement demonstrated the qualifications necessary to successfully perform an elevator modernization project. Licensing, technical capability, and industry experience were not the deciding factors. Where proposals began to differentiate was in how each organization presented its experience, technical resources, modernization philosophy, and long-term service strategy. Some proposals relied on the strength of an established brand, while others emphasized specialized modernization experience, engineering processes, or life cycle planning. The strongest proposals made it easy for ownership to understand not only who the contractor was, but why their experience reduced project risk and supported the owner's long-term objectives. Clear organizational positioning, well-documented qualifications, and a compelling modernization narrative consistently increased confidence during the evaluation. For vendors, the takeaway is that qualifications alone rarely create a competitive advantage. Most qualified contractors possess similar technical capabilities. What separates proposals is how effectively those capabilities are communicated, documented, and connected to the owner's decision-making process. The proposals that scored highest translated technical experience into owner confidence by clearly explaining their expertise, modernization approach, and long-term value, not simply listing credentials. All 5 vendors demonstrated the qualifications necessary to perform elevator modernization work. The primary differences were not licensing or eligibility, but rather how each organization communicated its experience, modernization philosophy, technical resources, and long-term service strategy. Vendors that clearly documented these differentiators made evaluation more efficient and strengthened confidence in their proposals. The objective of this section is simple: help every participating contractor become more competitive in future procurements by understanding how owners evaluate proposals, not just how contractors prepare them. Vendor 1 submitted a competitive and well-balanced modernization proposal with a comprehensive scope and a competitive project schedule. The proposal demonstrated a solid understanding of the modernization requirements. However, greater owner coordination requirements, limited lifecycle planning, and reliance on proprietary equipment reduced overall competitiveness. Providing additional long-term planning information and further reducing owner responsibilities would strengthen future proposals. Vendor 1 submitted a technically sound and competitive modernization proposal that performed well across several evaluation categories. The proposal demonstrated a comprehensive modernization scope and leveraged the strength of a well-established OEM organization. The primary opportunities to improve competitiveness were not related to technical capability, but to reducing owner uncertainty. First, transferring additional coordination responsibilities away from ownership would have strengthened the proposal by reducing perceived project risk and improving overall comparability. Second, expanding lifecycle documentation, particularly regarding retained equipment, expected service life, and long-term maintenance strategy, would have increased owner confidence in the modernization approach. Third, greater pricing transparency, including clearer documentation of assumptions, exclusions, and optional work, would have made the proposal easier to evaluate alongside competing submissions. Finally, because the proposal utilized a proprietary OEM equipment strategy, providing additional discussion around long-term service flexibility, future upgrade options, and lifecycle value could have addressed owner concerns regarding long-term dependence on a single equipment ecosystem. Overall, these improvements are largely documentation and communication enhancements rather than changes to the technical solution itself. They represent opportunities to strengthen future proposals while building greater owner confidence during competitive evaluations. Vendor 2 presented a technically competitive proposal with well-organized documentation and a comprehensive modernization approach. Independent equipment selection was viewed positively. However, above-average pricing, longer project duration, and increased owner coordination requirements reduced the proposal's overall competitive position. Greater execution efficiency and reduced owner responsibility could improve future evaluations. Vendor 2 presented a technically capable proposal with strong engineering documentation and a well-structured modernization approach. Following normalization, the proposal compared favorably with the broader competitive field. The primary opportunity for improvement is reducing the level of owner coordination required throughout the project. Clearly, assuming responsibility for more coordination activities would reduce perceived owner risk and make the proposal more attractive during comparative evaluations. The proposed execution schedule was also longer than several competing proposals. If additional time is necessary to improve quality or reduce project risk, explaining that rationale more clearly would help owners understand the value of the extended timeline. Additional lifecycle documentation, particularly regarding retained equipment, long-term maintenance expectations, and future service strategy, would further strengthen owner confidence in the proposed solution. Finally, providing clearer explanations for retained equipment and the overall modernization philosophy would reduce uncertainty and improve proposal comparability. Overall, Vendor 2 submitted a competitive proposal with solid technical merit. The greatest opportunities lie in reducing owner exposure, strengthening lifecycle communication, and making the proposal easier for ownership to evaluate and compare against competing submissions. Vendor 3 delivered the strongest overall balance of technical scope, commercial competitiveness, lifecycle planning, documentation, and execution strategy. The proposal clearly communicated long-term value while maintaining a reasonable allocation of owner responsibilities and project risk. The combination of competitive pricing, comprehensive modernization, and clear project planning resulted in the highest overall evaluation. Vendor 3. The primary recommendation is to maintain the high standard of proposal quality and documentation that contributed to its competitive position. The proposal consistently provided the level of clarity and completeness owners look for during complex modernization procurements. Continuing to include detailed lifecycle planning and long-term maintenance considerations will remain a competitive advantage as owners increasingly evaluate projects based on total lifecycle value rather than initial installation cost alone. There is also an opportunity to further expand pricing normalization by separating optional work and identifying assumptions with even greater precision. While this had minimal impact on the evaluation, additional transparency can make future proposals even easier to compare. Finally, preserving the balanced allocation of owner and contractor responsibilities will continue to strengthen proposal competitiveness by reducing uncertainty and increasing owner confidence. Overall, Vendor 3 established a strong benchmark for modernization proposals. The recommendations provided are intended as refinements to an already highly competitive submission, rather than significant changes to its overall approach. Vendor 4 submitted the lowest initial price, demonstrating strong cost competitiveness. However, the proposal included a more limited modernization scope, greater owner responsibilities, and less supporting documentation than competing submissions. While the pricing was attractive, the additional owner exposure and reduced project scope lowered overall competitiveness. Expanding scope definition and reducing owner assumptions would strengthen future proposals. Vendor 4 presented one of the most comprehensive modernization solutions in the procurement, with strong lifecycle planning, low owner responsibility, and a well-defined long-term service strategy. The proposal demonstrated a clear understanding of owner priorities, but was ultimately affected by its higher initial capital cost. The greatest opportunity is to evaluate ways to improve price competitiveness without materially reducing the overall modernization scope or long-term value proposition. Even modest improvements in initial pricing could significantly strengthen future competitive positioning. The proposal's comprehensive scope should be preserved, as it addressed many of the elements owners value most, including modernization, completeness, and reduced long-term operational risk. Continuing to emphasize lifecycle planning, long-term maintainability, and future service flexibility will remain a competitive advantage, particularly for owners evaluating total cost of ownership rather than lowest initial price. Finally, maintaining the proposal's strategy of minimizing owner responsibilities and clearly allocating project coordination will continue to build owner confidence and reduce perceived project risk. Overall, Vendor 4 submitted a technically strong and owner-focused proposal. With improved initial price competitiveness while maintaining its current strengths, the proposal would be well-positioned for future modernization procurements. Vendor 5 submitted the most comprehensive modernization proposal, offering exceptional documentation, long-term lifecycle planning, minimal owner responsibilities, and a strong execution strategy. These strengths position the proposal among the highest-ranked submissions. Ultimately, the proposal's higher initial investment reduced its overall competitiveness when compared to the winning proposal's balance of price and overall value. Vendor 5 submitted one of the strongest proposals in this procurement, ultimately ranking second overall. The proposal was exceptionally comprehensive, offered the lowest owner responsibility, provided strong lifecycle planning, and demonstrated a clear long-term modernization strategy. The primary factor affecting its final ranking was the higher initial capital investment. The greatest opportunity is to explore ways to improve initial price competitiveness while preserving the proposal's overall value and technical strength. Even modest reductions in upfront cost could significantly improve competitiveness in closely contested procurements. The proposal's comprehensive modernization scope should remain a core differentiator, as it aligned well with owner expectations for long-term asset performance and reduced future risk. Continuing to emphasize lifecycle planning, non-proprietary equipment strategy, and long-term service flexibility will reinforce the proposal's value, particularly for owners focused on total cost of ownership rather than initial price alone. Finally, maintaining the proposal's strategy of minimizing owner responsibilities and clearly allocating project coordination will continue to reduce owner risk and strengthen evaluation confidence. Overall, Vendor 5 presented an exceptionally strong owner-focused proposal. With improved initial price competitiveness while maintaining its current strengths, the proposal would be well-positioned to achieve the highest overall ranking in future modernization procurements. This section explains the characteristics that consistently increased evaluation, confidence, and how those characteristics collectively influence the final recommendation. No single factor determined the outcome. The final ranking reflects the cumulative balance of technical scope, commercial structure, execution strategy, owner responsibility, lifecycle planning, and proposal clarity. Although every contractor submitted a modernization solution and several proposals were highly competitive, the comparative evaluation ultimately identified one proposal that achieved the strongest overall balance across the evaluation criteria. One of the biggest misconceptions in competitive procurement is that projects are awarded based on one deciding factor. They usually are not. The highest scoring proposal was not simply the lowest price, the largest scope, or the most experienced contractor. Instead, it consistently reduced uncertainty across nearly every evaluation category. Each individual advantage may have been relatively small, but together they created greater confidence that the project would proceed with fewer unknowns, fewer assumptions, and fewer surprises. The winning proposal rarely dominates every category. Instead, it avoids weaknesses. During this evaluation, the highest-ranked proposal consistently scored well across technical, execution, documentation, and lifecycle considerations. Rather than excelling in only one area, it avoided creating uncertainty in any area. This slide is important. None of these observations prevented a proposal from being successful. Several proposals remained highly competitive. However, each contained one or more characteristics that slightly reduced evaluation confidence when compared with the highest-ranked submission. Those small differences accumulated throughout the comparative evaluation. Proposabid believes this is one of the most valuable lessons from the procurement. The selected proposal was not perfect. Every proposal contained strengths. Every proposal contained opportunities for improvement. What ultimately distinguished the selected proposal was that it consistently reduced uncertainty across the evaluation. That is what owners purchase: confidence. When contractors reduce uncertainty through better documentation, clearer scope definition, thoughtful lifecycle planning, realistic execution strategies, and transparent commercial structures, they significantly improve their competitiveness, even when competing against larger organizations or lower-priced proposals. The Jeanne Manor Elevator Modernization Procurement demonstrated that today's competitive procurements are decided by far more than price. All 5 contractors independently recommended modernization, confirming industry consensus regarding the appropriate long-term solution. The comparative evaluation ultimately focused on how each proposal balanced technical scope, commercial structure, owner responsibilities, execution strategy, lifecycle planning, and overall proposal clarity. The selected proposal achieved the strongest overall balance across these evaluation variables while maintaining a commercially competitive investment. Several consistent themes emerged across all 5 proposals. First, it's important to recognize that every participating contractor demonstrated the technical capability to successfully modernize these elevators. This evaluation was not about determining whether vendors could perform the work. It was about understanding which proposal provided the greatest overall confidence and value for the owner. One of the most significant differentiators was proposal quality. Well-organized, clearly documented proposals made it easier to understand the intended scope, commercial assumptions, and execution strategy. In many cases, stronger documentation increased confidence in the proposal itself. Another recurring theme was owner responsibility. Proposals that transferred more coordination, procurement, or construction responsibility back to ownership generally introduced additional project risk. Conversely, proposals that clearly defined responsibilities and minimized owner involvement were viewed more favorably. We also found that long-term lifecycle planning and proposal transparency consistently improved competitiveness. Vendors who explained not only what they were replacing, but why, how those decisions supported long-term reliability, and what owners could expect over the next 15 to 25 years, differentiated themselves from the broader field. Finally, this procurement reinforced an important principle. The evaluation reflected the cumulative balance of many factors, not a single deciding criterion. Price, technical scope, documentation, life cycle planning, scheduling, commercial clarity, execution strategy, and owner risk allocation all contributed to the final evaluation. The strongest proposals were those that reduced uncertainty, communicated clearly, and provided owners with confidence that the modernization could be successfully delivered with minimal long-term risk. One observation stands out above all others. Every contractor demonstrated the technical capability to perform this modernization. This procurement was never about determining who was qualified to perform elevator work. It was about determining which proposal provided ownership with the greatest confidence in achieving a successful project outcome. The evaluation considered technical, commercial, operational, and life cycle factors together. No single category determined the final recommendation. The goal of this report is not simply to explain the outcome of one procurement, but to provide practical benchmarking insights that participating vendors can use to strengthen future proposals and remain competitive in an increasingly sophisticated procurement environment. As we conclude this comparative review, it's worth stepping back and looking at what this procurement demonstrated about the elevator modernization market as a whole. One of the clearest findings was that all participating vendors independently arrived at a similar modernization strategy. While equipment selections varied slightly, there was broad consensus on the overall technical approach required to modernize this building. What ultimately separated proposals was not simply the equipment being installed. The strongest proposals distinguished themselves through commercial structure, documentation quality, lifecycle planning, execution strategy, and how clearly responsibilities were defined throughout the project. We also observed that proposals with more complete documentation created greater evaluation confidence. When assumptions were clearly explained and technical decisions were well documented, owners were better able to understand value and compare proposals objectively. Another important finding was the impact of owner responsibilities. Proposals that shifted coordination, restoration, permitting, or third-party management back to ownership increased perceived project risk and reduced overall competitiveness. Finally, this procurement reinforced an industry trend. Owners are evaluating modernization projects over their full life cycle, not just on initial installation cost. Long-term maintainability, service flexibility, documentation quality, and reduced operational risk increasingly influence procurement decisions. The key takeaway is that competitive procurement is not simply about identifying the lowest bidder, it is about identifying the proposal that provides the greatest confidence, clarity, and long-term value for the owner. Every proposal contributes valuable, competitive insight. Every procurement creates opportunities for continuous improvement. Transparent comparative evaluation strengthens owners, contractors, and ultimately, the industry itself. I'd like to close by thanking every contractor who participated in this procurement. Competitive procurement only works when experienced firms invest the time and expertise required to develop thoughtful proposals. Each submission contributed to a stronger decision process and provided meaningful insight into different modernization strategies. Our goal is not simply to identify a recommendation for one project, it is to improve the quality of procurement across the industry. When owners receive clearer proposals, vendors better communicate their value, and procurement decisions are based on transparency rather than assumptions. Everyone benefits: the owner, the contractor, and the industry as a whole. On behalf of Proposabid, thank you for your participation, your professionalism, and your commitment to advancing competitive procurement. Every proposal submitted contributed to a stronger procurement process. Proposabid believes competitive procurements should create value for both owners and vendors. By providing comparative benchmarking and evaluation feedback, our goal is to help contractors better understand owner priorities, strengthen future proposals, and improve competitiveness across the industry. Thank you for the time, engineering expertise, and professional effort invested in preparing your proposal. We sincerely appreciate your participation and look forward to the opportunity to work with you on future procurements. As we conclude this report, we'd like to sincerely thank every contractor who participated in the Jeanne Manor Elevator Modernization Procurement. Preparing a competitive proposal requires significant engineering effort, estimating resources, site investigation, coordination, and technical expertise. We recognize that commitment and appreciate the professionalism demonstrated by every participating vendor. At Proposabid, we believe procurement should not end with simply announcing an award. It should also provide meaningful feedback that helps contractors understand how proposals are evaluated, where opportunities exist for improvement, and how future submissions can become even more competitive. While only one proposal can ultimately be selected, every proposal contributed to a stronger decision-making process for the owner. We hope the benchmarking and comparative observations shared in this report provide practical value that extends beyond this project. Thank you again for your participation. We look forward to the opportunity to include your organization in future procurement opportunities.